Once upon a time, in a quiet village at the edge of a deep, dark forest, there lived a young girl named Alara with her parents. They had a small house on a hill, surrounded by thick trees and echoing silence. Alara was a gentle, quiet girl with a dreamy heart, often lost in her own world. She spoke of strange dreams, of whispers at her window, of shadows that danced on moonlit nights. Her parents thought she just had an active imagination and would laugh it off. One evening, Alara came to her parents with an odd look in her eyes. She told them she was in love with a ghost. She said it with such certainty, her voice soft but steady, her gaze fixed beyond them, as if she could see this spirit right then. Her parents chuckled and told her that she was too young to understand such things and that ghosts didn't exist. But Alara insisted. She said the ghost visited her in her dreams, calling her name in a voice that was as smooth as the wind and as gentle as falling rain. She said he told her secrets of the forest, things no one else knew. Her parents thought it was just a fantasy. They nodded and smiled but didn't pay much attention. Days turned into weeks, and Alara continued to talk about her ghostly lover. She'd say, "He was here last night. He told me stories of the stars," or "He walked me through the forest under the moonlight." Her parents always dismissed it, though sometimes her mother looked at her, slightly worried, sensing something strange but never daring to question it. Then, one day, Alara made an announcement that froze the smiles on her parents' faces. She sat at the dinner table, her hands folded, her expression serious. Her eyes were dark, almost haunted, and in a soft voice she said, "I'm pregnant." Her parents stared at her, shocked beyond words. Her mother's hand flew to her mouth, and her father's face turned pale. They tried to understand, to make sense of her words, but their minds reeled. How could she be pregnant? She was just a girl, and she hardly ever left the house, let alone met anyone. How? How did this happen? Her mother stammered, her voice barely a whisper. Alara looked down at her hands, her cheeks turning red. She spoke so softly they had to lean in to hear her. "It's him," she said. "The ghost. The one I love. He comes to me at night." Her parents' faces twisted with confusion and fear. Her father shook his head, thinking maybe it was just another part of her strange imagination. But Alara's serious expression, her trembling hands, made them feel a cold dread creeping in. Over the next few days, Alara grew more distant. She hardly spoke, only staring out the window as if waiting for something. Her mother watched her closely, now convinced there was more to this than a young girl's fantasy. She noticed Alara's color changing, her cheeks growing pale, her energy fading. It was as if something was draining the life out of her. One night, her mother decided to stay awake and watch. She waited outside Alara's room, her heart pounding, her eyes wide in the dim light of the hallway. She wanted to believe it was just a dream, but deep down, she felt a dark fear creeping in, a sense that something was very, very wrong. At the stroke of midnight, she heard it a whisper, soft and low, echoing through the door. She couldn't make out the words, but she could feel the coldness in the air. a chill that seemed to seep through the walls. Her heart raced, and for a moment she thought of opening the door. But fear held her back. She only stood there, frozen, listening to the voice, to her daughter's soft replies, her heart heavy with dread. When morning came, she finally gathered the courage to confront Alara. She tried to ask her to understand, but Alara only looked at her with those strange, distant eyes and whispered, "He loves me, Mother. He's not a ghost. He's something more." The days after that were heavy with tension. Alara's father grew frustrated, muttering about nonsense and childish dreams, but her mother was haunted by what she had seen, or rather, what she had felt. She watched her daughter like a hawk, noticing every change: Alara's skin growing paler, her eyes duller, her steps slower. It was as though something was draining her from the inside. Then one night, Alara's mother could no longer stand the silence. She pulled her husband aside and whispered about the strange sounds she had heard. She confessed her fear, her worry that something was truly haunting their daughter, something beyond the veil of life and death. Her husband, though skeptical, couldn't ignore the dark circles beneath his wife's eyes, the dread in her voice. So reluctantly they agreed to keep watch together, to stay awake by Alara's door and wait for whatever strange presence might come. That night, they sat outside her room, ears alert, hearts thumping as the clock struck midnight. At first there was only silence. The house was still, the air thick with tension. But then faintly came the sound, a soft, cold whisper like a winter wind slipping through cracks in the walls. It was a voice, low and hollow, whispering words they couldn't understand. Her father's face grew pale as he strained to listen. The voice was not Alara's, nor was it anything he had ever heard. It sounded neither human nor earthly. It was a haunting murmur that seemed to chill his very bones. He shivered and reached for his wife's hand, clutching it tightly, both of them frozen in fear. The whispering grew louder, filled with a strange urgency. And then, mingling with it, they heard Alara's voice, soft and pleading. "Please, don't leave me," she murmured. "I love you. Stay with me." Her mother's heart ached at the words, the desperation in her daughter's voice. But just as she was about to open the door, a loud knock shattered the silence. It came from the window in Alara's room, a rhythmic tapping that sounded like skeletal fingers drumming against the glass. The parents gasped, terror clutching at their throats. Her father grabbed his wife's arm, pulling her back, his face ashen with fear. "We need to get her out of here," he whispered, his voice shaking. This isn't right." The next morning they tried to speak to Alara again to convince her to leave with them. But she was distant, her face pale, her eyes haunted. She clutched her stomach protectively, a strange smile on her lips. "He's here," she whispered, more to herself than to them. "He promised he would never leave me." Her parents exchanged a fearful glance, unsure of what to do. They thought about calling a doctor, but deep down they knew this was beyond medicine. So they went to the village priest, an old man with a knowing look in his eyes, as though he had seen things most people would rather forget. They told him about Alara, about her ghostly lover, about the whispers in the night. The priest listened quietly, his face growing graver with every word. When they had finished, he let out a deep sigh and folded his hands. There are things in this world that dwell in the shadows, he murmured. Things that feed on the souls of the living, disguising themselves as loved ones, as something beautiful. I fear your daughter has drawn the attention of one of these spirits. The parents stared at him, horrified. Is there anything we can do? Her mother whispered, her voice trembling. The priest nodded slowly. We must bring her here, to the church. The spirit cannot follow her onto sacred ground. But we must act quickly. Such spirits do not easily let go of those they claim. Desperate and fearful, her parents hurried home to Alara. They found her sitting by the window, her gaze distant, her hand resting on her stomach. She didn't resist when they told her to come with them. Only murmured softly, "He won't like it. He doesn't like to be away from me." As they led her down the hill toward the village, the wind began to howl, cold and sharp, swirling around them like invisible hands trying to pull her back. Alara looked over her shoulder, her eyes wide with fear, but her parents gripped her hands tightly, whispering words of comfort as they quickened their pace. When they finally reached the church, the priest was waiting for them at the door, holding a silver cross and murmuring prayers under his breath. He guided them inside, shutting the heavy wooden door behind them, and led them to the altar, where a circle of candles flickered in the dim light. Alara stood in the center of the circle, her face pale, her eyes hollow. The priest began to chant, his voice low and steady, filling the room with a powerful energy. The flames of the candles flickered wildly, casting eerie shadows on the walls, and a cold wind began to whip through the room, carrying with it a faint, haunting whisper. Alara, the voice called, echoing through the air. Come back to me. Alara's face twisted with anguish, and she took a step toward the voice, her hand outstretched. Her parents held her back, their faces filled with fear and desperation. The priest's chanting grew louder, his voice a powerful shield against the dark presence that lingered just beyond the walls of the church. But then, something strange happened. The wind died down and the room fell silent. Alara's face softened, her eyes growing calm, as though a spell had been broken. She looked at her parents, her gaze clear for the first time in weeks, and whispered, "He's gone." Her mother let out a sob of relief, pulling her daughter into a tight embrace. Her father placed a hand on her shoulder, his face filled with a mixture of relief and sorrow. But the priest's face was still grave. He looked at Alara, his eyes filled with a deep sadness, and said, "There is something else, isn't there?" Alara nodded slowly, her hand drifting to her stomach. "Yes," she whispered, "but it's not a spirit. It was never a ghost." Her parents looked at her, confused, fear creeping back into their hearts. "What do you mean?" her mother asked, her voice barely a whisper. Alara looked down, her cheeks pale, her eyes filled with a haunted knowledge. She took a deep breath, steadying herself before she spoke. It was a man, she said softly. He came to me in the night, pretending to be something beautiful, something otherworldly. He told me he was a spirit, a ghost who loved me. But he was real, flesh and blood. And she trailed off, her voice choked with emotion. Her parents stared at her, horror dawning in their eyes. The priest bowed his head, his face lined with sorrow and anger. Such darkness hides in the shadows of this world, he murmured. Sometimes the monsters we fear are not from the realm of the dead. Sometimes they walk among us, hiding their true faces until it is too late. Alara's parents held her tightly, their hearts filled with a deep sorrow. They had ignored her cries, brushed off her fears, and now they paid the price. They vowed to protect her, to keep her safe, but the scars of that night would linger forever. And as the dawn broke over the village, the church bells tolled, echoing a somber warning to all who heard, beware the shadows, for not all that hides within them is a ghost. Alara's parents held her close as dawn painted the sky with soft shades of pink and gold, a stark contrast to the darkness they had escaped. The light of the morning seemed to bring a small comfort, a reminder that even after the darkest night, the sun would always rise again. The priest watched them with quiet compassion, his old, wise eyes filled with sorrow. He stepped forward, placing a gentle hand on Alara's shoulder. "You are brave, child," he said softly. "You walked through shadows that would break even the strongest hearts, but now you are free." Alara looked at him, her face still pale, but her eyes held a new strength, a fierce determination. She nodded, understanding in her heart that she had to heal not just for herself but for her parents, who had stood by her even when they were afraid. She whispered, "I'll be all right someday." As they left the church and walked back up the hill toward their home, her parents spoke gently to her, promising they would listen to her always, that they would keep her safe from the shadows that had haunted her. Alara held their hands tightly, knowing that no matter what lay ahead, she would not face it alone. Time passed, and though it was not easy, Alara began to heal. She grew stronger each day, and her parents supported her, their love a quiet, steady strength that guided her back to the light. The shadows that had once haunted her dreams faded, replaced by warm memories of family, of love, of the strength they had found together. And when she looked back on those dark days, she found herself understanding something deeply and beautifully true: not all ghosts are spirits, and not all shadows come from the dead. Sometimes the real monsters are the ones who wear friendly faces, who hide their darkness in plain sight. But even in the darkest shadows, there can be light of family's love, the courage to face fear, and the strength to heal. One evening, as the sun set over the village and painted the sky in warm hues, Alara stood with her parents, looking out at the forest below. She felt a calm settle over her, a peace she hadn't felt in a long time. She knew that while life was fragile, it was also beautiful, and that real strength came from love and courage, from facing even the darkest nights with hope. And as she watched the last rays of sunlight fade, she whispered to herself, the shadows will come again. But I am not afraid, for I have the light within me. The story of Alara and her family spread through the village, told in whispers around fires and in quiet conversations. It became a tale of strength and healing, a reminder that love could conquer even the darkest shadows. And as people heard her story, they learned to listen more closely, to love more deeply, and to believe that even in the face of fear, light could always find its way through. In life, the greatest battles are often not fought with swords or shields, but with open hearts and unyielding spirits. True bravery is not the absence of fear, but the willingness to face it, to stand in the darkness with hope as your guide. Alara's journey taught those who heard her story that while the world may hold its shadows, the light within us will always lead us home. And so Alara, her family, and their love became a part of the village's spirit, a quiet strength against the shadows that would forever linger at the edge of their lives, and a beacon of hope for those who might need it someday.